This kind of playing attitude is unacceptable." The sentence didn't echo through the room, it dropped into it like a stone into still water, heavy enough to change everything instantly. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Not the comfortable silence of understanding, but the kind that appears when people realize they've just heard something they were never supposed to hear spoken out loud. Reporters froze, pens stopped moving, and cameras continued recording without interruption, capturing a moment that already felt larger than the game itself. Because this wasn't just frustration after a loss. This was something deeper, something that came from a place of expectation, disappointment, and standards that had clearly been crossed. And the person who said it was not someone known for emotional outbursts. That made it even heavier. It had been a brutal night long before those words were spoken. The scoreboard told the simplest version of the story, a 12-run defeat, one of those losses that does not slowly develop but instead breaks open and refuses to close. From early innings, there had been warning signs, missed chances, loose execution, moments where control seemed just out of reach. As the innings passed, those small cracks widened until the entire structure of the game collapsed. By the time the final out arrived, the stadium no longer felt like a place of competition. It felt empty even while people were still inside it. Fans left early, not out of anger alone, but out of disbelief, as if staying longer would somehow require accepting something they were not ready to process. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere was heavier than the score itself. Players sat in silence, some staring at lockers, others scrolling aimlessly through their phones, avoiding eye contact, avoiding conversation, avoiding anything that might force them to explain what had just happened. Equipment bags were packed slowly, almost mechanically, as if speed would make the reality worse. This was not unfamiliar territory for any professional team. Every season contains losses, but the manner of this defeat carried a different weight. It wasn't just that they lost, it was how they looked while losing. That distinction lingered in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. At certain points in the game, the unraveling had been almost visible in real time. There was a sequence in the middle innings that many would later point to as the turning point, not because it was spectacular, but because it was ordinary. A routine play, the kind that major league players complete thousands of times without thought, became the moment everything slipped. The reaction was a fraction late, the urgency slightly absent, the execution just off enough to turn an out into an opening. And in baseball, openings are all that elite opponents need. What followed was not immediate chaos, but a gradual expansion of pressure, like air filling a space that had suddenly been left unguarded. One run became two, two became four, and soon the inning no longer felt like an inning, it felt like a collapse in slow motion. From the dugout, reactions began to shift. A veteran's head turned away after one sequence. A coach leaned forward with his hands on his knees, watching without speaking. Even the broadcast cameras picked up subtle changes in body language that told a story more honest than the scoreboard. Effort, in moments like these, becomes magnified. Not because players stop trying, but because fatigue, frustration, and pressure begin to expose the smallest differences in urgency. And those differences, whether fair or not, become the language through which teammates judge one another. Shohei Ohtani, however, remained one of the few constant figures in the chaos. Even as the game slipped further out of reach, his presence did not change. His preparation between pitches remained identical, his focus unbroken, his intensity unaffected by the widening score. Each at-bat carried the same structure, the same discipline, the same quiet refusal to disengage. In games like this, where outcome feels predetermined, such consistency becomes more visible than usual. It does not erase the loss, but it creates contrast between those who drift and those who continue to compete as if the game still matters in the same way it did in the first inning. By the time the final out was recorded, the damage was already complete. There was no dramatic moment at the end, no final emotional eruption, only the slow realization that everything had already been decided long before the game officially ended. Players walked off the field in different states, some expressionless, some frustrated, some simply exhausted by the weight of what had unfolded. And yet, even then, the most important reactions had not yet come. That came later, in a room filled with cameras and questions that always arrive too soon after losses like this. At first, the veteran pitcher answered calmly, as expected, offering standard reflections, measured responses, carefully chosen words that revealed little and protected everything. But as the questions shifted, so did something in the atmosphere. The tone of inquiry changed from technical to emotional, from what happened to how it felt, and that is often where control begins to slip. A pause stretched longer than usual. A glance downward lasted just a second too long. And then, without raising his voice, without dramatics, without hesitation, he delivered the sentence that would define the night far beyond the scoreboard. This kind of playing attitude is unacceptable. And just like that, the game was no longer just about 12 runs. It was about something else entirely. The moment those words left the veteran pitcher's mouth, the room changed again, this time not into silence, but into something sharper. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone understands they are witnessing a line being crossed, even if no names were spoken. Reporters looked at each other briefly, almost instinctively, searching for confirmation of what had just been implied. The pitcher did not elaborate. He did not soften the statement. He did not explain who or what specifically triggered it. He simply leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and continued answering the next question as if nothing had happened. But nothing about the room remained normal after that. Outside the media room, the reaction began almost immediately. Clips of the quote spread across sports networks within minutes. Unacceptable playing attitude became the phrase that dominated headlines, repeated, replayed, and analyzed from every angle. Analysts tried to decode tone, context, and intent. Some argued it was simply frustration after a humiliating 12-run defeat, the kind of emotional release that happens in long seasons under pressure. Others saw something deeper, a veteran drawing a clear boundary inside a clubhouse that was beginning to fracture under expectations, contracts, and performance gaps that could no longer be ignored. Inside that uncertainty, one name kept surfacing without being spoken directly in the press conference: Shohei Ohtani. Not because he was accused, and not because he was singled out, but because he represented the standard that made silence feel heavier. Throughout the game, his consistency had stood in contrast to the collapse around him. That contrast now became part of the conversation. In debates across television panels and online discussions, people asked the same question in different forms: when standards are spoken about so strongly, who are they meant for? Within the organization, however, there was no public response. No clarification came from the clubhouse. No follow-up statement softened the impact. Instead, what remained was interpretation, and interpretation is where pressure multiplies. Coaches avoided speculation. Teammates avoided microphones. Even those who disagreed with the tone of the criticism understood the reality behind it. Losses of this magnitude do not disappear quietly, and leadership in professional baseball often arrives in uncomfortable forms. Hours later, as the stadium emptied and lights dimmed, the echoes of the night lingered in a different way. Not in the scoreboard, which would eventually be forgotten in a long season, but in the words that refused to fade. Unacceptable playing attitude had become more than a comment, it had become a reference point, something people would return to when discussing accountability, effort, and expectation inside a high-pressure team. And yet, beneath all the debate, one simple truth remained untouched. The game had been lost long before the final out. The emotions that followed were not created in a press conference, they were only exposed there. Because in baseball, as in everything built on repetition and pressure, what is said after the game often reveals what could not be controlled during it. And on this night, after 12 runs, one veteran's words ensured that the conversation would not end with the final score.